Imagine you stand under the iron words at the gate as a Swiss Red Cross worker raises a white cloth at mid-afternoon, and an SS lieutenant produces a typed surrender note, the paper creased, the ink still fresh. Outside, vehicles from the U.S. 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions idle, their engines ticking, as orders for the push on Munich have bent toward this stop 16 kilometers northwest of the city. The air carries a sour, chemical edge from the disinfection blocks. While one column edges toward the Jurhaus, another swings past the rail spur, setting up the split that will define the next hour. The words on the gate, Arbeit macht frei, do not shift in the breeze, rusted iron unmoved as boots and treads grind to a stop outside. The Jurhaus guardhouse, which once mediated thousands of daily lives with barked numbers and beatings, now becomes a negotiation post. The SS officer, later identified by Swiss liaison Victor Mora as a junior lieutenant named Heinrich Wicker, had been stationed at the camp for only days. His superiors, like nearly all senior Dachau officials, had fled on the evening of April 26, leaving a vacuum as Allied troops closed in. His typed note, bearing unofficial surrender terms and requesting protection for the civilians and medical personnel inside, had no formal legal weight. Yet it was taken, photographed, and passed up the chain. Brigadier General Henning Linden of the 42nd Infantry Division led the American force that entered through the Jurhaus under cautious cover. His party included war correspondents and Signal Corps documentarians, who began capturing the initial scenes almost immediately. The Swiss flag of truce, neutral and fragile, flanked combat-ready American infantry and jittery SS guards with their arms raised or discarded. No coordinated resistance came from the sentries still perched in towers. The surrender was verbal and partial, offered more as a gesture than a structured transfer of authority. U.S. forces moved quickly to secure weapons and identify key structures. The barracks area, still populated by over 30,000 prisoners, was quarantined by medics and engineers as rumors of disease spread: typhus, dysentery, starvation, edema. Beneath this epidemiological urgency, however, churned another narrative forming along the perimeter. To the west, a second prong of the American approach had encountered scenes beyond accounting. A rail spur, drawn up within range of the camp, held what became one of the grim emblems of Nazi ruthlessness. 39 boxcars, many sealed, filled with human remains. It was a death transport, sent from Buchenwald nearly 3 weeks earlier, stranded by sabotage, bombing, and fuel shortages. Soldiers of the 157th Infantry Regiment, part of the 45th Division, had followed the spur line and found car after car opened with rifles and bayonets as stench gave cues before vision could confirm. The juxtaposition was immediate and irreconcilable: surrender and atrocity within a few hundred meters. While U.S. officers at the front of the camp moved cautiously forward under a white flag, their counterparts stepping around mangled corpses by the siding shifted instantly from combat readiness to stunned horror. No training manual covered this. Even before the camp itself was fully entered, before the crematoriums or the bunkhouses were seen, the rail spur defined the moral and emotional terrain. The massacre in transit, an execution by attrition more than bullet, shocked battle-hardened men who had fought through Anzio, the Vosges, and the Siegfried Line. It reframed the role of liberator as something much darker. On the field reports and in the diaries later collected, the time splits. 1400 hours, surrender signaled at the Jurhaus. 1430 hours, discovery at the siding. Anger, disbelief, and revulsion arrive within the half hour. Communications between advancing units grow harder to manage as scenes like those at the spur unhinge expectation and training. Dachau, unlike Oedruff or Nordhausen, was not a labor camp exposed after abandonment. It was intact. Its guards had not fully fled. Its victims were still dying, and its perpetrators still stood above ground, identifiable, awaiting fate not in hiding, but behind gates they once opened each morning. That fact, as much as the train, tilted a day of liberation toward moral rupture. You ride in the escort truck as it breaks near a siding. Boxcars stand open, wood splintered, and a heavy, sweet rot smell drifts across the gravel. Men of the 157th Infantry, 45th Division, track along 39 railcars from a Buchenwald transport, counting bodies in the hundreds, with estimates later reaching into the thousands. The discovery moves from shock to procedure, security, photographs, reporting, but the sight bleeds forward into the rest of the day. As the surrender unfolds at the gate, the train tilts tempers and decisions toward violence. The train had arrived at Dachau hours or perhaps days before the Americans. It hadn't moved under power for some time. Allied bombing had severed rail lines, German withdrawals had reshuffled priorities, and the final failing weeks of the Third Reich had left cargo stranded and starved across Bavaria. This particular train had left Buchenwald around April 7, 1945, an evacuation forced at gunpoint as American forces neared the Weimar area. Nearly 5,000 prisoners, mostly political detainees, Jews, and Soviet POWs, were jammed into the sealed cars with little food, virtually no water, and no medical care. The trip, which might once have taken 2 days in full operation, stalled into a 22-day drift of neglect, starvation, and death. By the time the 157th Regiment reached the rail spur outside Dachau, only a few dozen survivors remained inside the train. They stumbled out, dazed and skeletal, from cars where dozens of others had died around them. Signal Corps teams, trained to capture battlefield movement, now documented the stillness of the aftermath. Shoes without feet, limbs hanging from slats, jaws locked in rigor mortis. The smell, sour, organic decomposition, is often described in war memoirs but never fully conveyed. Soldiers gagged behind improvised neckerchiefs before they counted, before they processed. Captain John Dallebois and other interrogators would later identify the train as a result of orders issued by SS leadership in Buchenwald, eager to evacuate camps ahead of advancing armies. Witnesses described guards randomly shooting into cars at stops and occasionally dragging out corpses to make room for fresh prisoners from other transports. The documents, later recovered from Reichsbahn ledgers and SS files, show the route of the train passing through Bamberg, Plattling, and Regensburg, halted repeatedly by damaged tracks or lack of fuel. No American field manual prepared infantrymen for this. Context arrived later, but the imagery was immediate and scarring. Riflemen from I Company and medics from regimental HHC formed around the cars, trying to coax information from the few stunned survivors. Back at Division HQ, reports were compiled and forwarded, stating plainly, hundreds found dead in train cars at Dachau siding, some showing signs of execution at close range, others emaciated past endurance. In the remainder of the day, the rail spur became a node of tension and repressed fury. Soldiers, trained to distinguish combatants from non-combatants, now faced men in SS uniforms rounding a barracks corner no more than 500 meters from the siding. Some SS men had quietly discarded shoulder tabs or painted blood onto civilian clothes in attempts to pass unnoticed. But the proximity of atrocity and perpetrator blurred legal and moral lines. Witnesses describe American soldiers pacing the length of the train with their weapons still raised, silent, faces drained, as officers tried to collect them back into formation. The surrender inside the Jurhaus had been formal but incomplete, piecemeal authority ceded from one SS officer and accepted by the Americans on paper. But here, at the railway siding, the war communicated itself without need for interpreters or documents. The pileup of corpses shouted louder than orders. The train left no ambiguity. Events that followed, executions in the coal yard, prisoner reprisals, chaotic retribution in alleys and buildings just beyond the main rails, cannot be understood without this hinge. The train reframed Dachau not as a camp in stasis, but as one node of a system still actively killing through neglect, malice, and inertia right up to the hour of liberation. It was not over. Not yet. A bolt slams forward on a captured machine gun. Coal dust hangs in the still air by a low wall inside the SS complex north of the main camp. SS men who had been rounded up after laying down arms are positioned along the bricks under guard from the same unit that found the train. In minutes, firing rips across the yard, bodies slide down, and the line collapses. The killing, later tallied in Inspector General files as at least dozens across several sites, spreads before anyone at the Jurhaus fully grasps the parallel track. The yard itself was bordered by a brick wall, partially shadowed by the barracks used by the SS Totenkopfverband and training personnel. Sandbags from the previous days of fighting remained stacked along the outer edge. A pile of cordwood sat in an adjacent alley, the coal dumped low in mounds from previous locomotive deliveries. Here, a group of between 15 and 20 captured SS men had been brought under armed guard, some still wearing full uniform, others in hastily donned workmen's clothing. The U.S. soldiers guarding them were from I Company of the 157th Infantry Regiment, the same unit that had just hours earlier encountered the Buchenwald death train. Many of them had moved directly from the boxcars to this enclosure, their reactions sharpened by what they had seen: mass corpses, survivors barely living, and the unmistakable evidence of systematized cruelty. The machine gun used in the execution was not standard U.S. Army issue. According to multiple witness affidavits later compiled by the U.S. Army Inspector General, it had been captured from German stock in the SS barracks. A German MG-34 or MG-42, models both found on the premises. One soldier later recounted positioning it facing the wall, while others compelled the prisoners to stand against it in rows. Firing began abruptly. Who gave the order remains disputed in official records. The Inspector General report, initiated weeks later, could not definitively establish whether it was a spontaneous act, a response to perceived defiance, or an unchecked moment of vengeance. What is not disputed is the result: sustained automatic fire into unarmed captives at close range. The impact flung some bodies backward, others collapsed at the wall. Ground accounts suggested some of the SS men had not yet been fully searched or processed. The gunfire echoed through the northern area of the camp, drawing in soldiers and medical teams who believed fresh combat had broken out. Confusion reigned for several minutes. Additional soldiers from the 45th arrived to find the gun cooling, belt-fed rounds half-spent, and bodies strewn without medical aid attempted. A few prisoners nearby, formerly under SS custody only hours before, watched the scene silently, their own judgment unreadable. Coal dust mixed with the blood on the yard floor. The smell lingered longer than the noise. The precise death toll at the coal yard remains unsettled, with Inspector General estimates ranging from 15 to 17 at that one location, though some post-war narratives inflate the number. What is clear is that the event was not isolated. Killings of captured SS personnel occurred in at least 3 additional locations across Dachau and the adjacent SS training school that afternoon. Near Guard Tower B, within a supply building, and behind a latrine by the northwest fence. The Inspector General's report, compiled in June 1945, logged witness statements, sketches, and time-stamped field reports. It concluded that, while the emotional state of the troops could be understood in the context of the train and the camp's horrors, the actions were clear violations of the laws of war. At headquarters, those findings would eventually hit a wall of silence, but not yet. Here, in the coal yard, the first signal of moral unraveling appeared not in defiance, but in the unstated approval of rage given too much room. The boundaries between enemy, prisoner, and perpetrator folded into coal dust, and the bark of a foreign weapon fired by American hands. A single handgun report cracks above the coal yard as a battalion commander from the 157th, moving in to survey, extends his arm and orders a halt. The machine gun stops. Guards are pulled back from the wall. Surviving prisoners and stunned soldiers crowd the edges. The intervention does not rewind what has happened. It arrests one scene and shunts the rest of the chaos into alleys, infirmaries, and the adjacent SS training barracks. The officer was Lieutenant Colonel Felix L. Sparks, commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Infantry Division. His arrival in the coal yard came minutes after sporadic reports of executions had begun filtering through field radios and runners. When he came upon the scene, bodies splayed along the wall, the German machine gun still manned, its barrel glowing faintly from recent use, he grasped the situation without needing explanation. Sparks drew his service pistol and fired a round into the air, not toward the guards or the prisoners, but straight up, cutting through the chaos with a signal that briefly returned shape to an unstructured moment. Eyewitness accounts later gathered by the U.S. Army Inspector General described Sparks walking directly to the machine gun nest, physically pushing troops aside and shouting for the firing to cease. He placed military police around the remaining prisoners and ordered their removal under guard. No formal courts-martial would follow this order, but the discipline he imposed reining in his men under those circumstances was later understood, even among Army leadership, as decisive and morally necessary. None of the SS men executed had been tried, interrogated, or individually identified by role. Victims of the shooting included low-ranking Waffen-SS from the training school and others captured in partial uniform, some still carrying personal effects that suggested quick surrender rather than resistance. Sparks' intervention prevented further killing in the coal yard, but the eruption of violence had already spread. In the blocks to the northeast, between the SS infirmary, vehicle sheds, and warehouse offices, American troops and freed prisoners were discovering other SS personnel in varying states of concealment, wearing civilian clothes, hiding in air raid shelters, or attempting to blend into labor details. Reports clocked scattered skirmishes and reprisals between 1,500 and 1,700 hours, limited in scope but highly charged. One U.S. platoon reported cornering a former Blockführer, who was immediately recognized and attacked by a crowd before MPs could secure him. The liberation of Dachau, unlike other camps such as Nordhausen or Belsen, unfolded in real time with personnel from both sides still alive, present, and visible. There was no pause between discovery and confrontation. This simultaneity introduced tensions that formal military law was barely equipped to address in a live combat zone. Sparks' shot into the sky marked not just the cessation of gunfire, but the beginning of a broader series of questions, legal, ethical, and deeply personal, about what justice looked like in the shadow of atrocity. Elsewhere on the grounds, company commanders issued standing orders to disarm all personnel, allied or otherwise, attempting to take action without command instructions. The machine gun was stripped of its bolt and sent to the quartermaster area. A chalk X was sketched on the wall below the bullet scoring where the dead had fallen, to be documented the following morning by Signal Corps investigators. The coal yard fell into silence, but the rage did not vanish. It relocated into confinement pens, courthouse dockets, and memory. Sparks' pistol shot held a line, but behind it, judgment had already started to fracture, not just between sides but within the liberating force itself. A handcart creaks down the Lagerstrasse. Sirens on American jeeps wail once and then decay to silence as the perimeter is secured. The liberation of Dachau marked the end of an institution, but not the end of its violence. With the outer gates sealed by American infantry, control should have shifted inward toward order. But for hours it did not. Freed inmates surged beyond their assigned barracks blocks, many barefoot or in mismatched scraps of uniform, pulling carts, prying open storerooms, and charging toward areas once strictly off-limits under SS control. The Lagerstrasse, the spine of the prisoners' compound, became a corridor of flashing motion, shouted names, halted carts, turned bodies, and a mounting mix of grief, rage, and retribution. Inside the SS quarters, along the edge of Block B, liberated prisoners hunted for those still in German gray. Some SS guards had attempted to pass among the prisoner population by discarding insignia, altering clothing, or claiming foreign nationality. Others had been captured earlier, disarmed, and posted for processing. But not all had surrendered. In certain barracks wings and under the floorboards of administrative buildings, squads of American soldiers and liberated detainees discovered SS men in hiding, some of whom were beaten or stabbed to death before they could be formally taken into custody. American field units lacked the immediate manpower to maintain medical triage, enforce command, and mediate prisoner conduct all at once. The 7th Army medical teams, tasked with halting the spread of typhus and dysentery, had repurposed camp infrastructure, converting blocks into emergency infirmaries. This reattachment of barrack space to nonviolent purpose was partial and fragile. Outside, the compound's orientation, for years reversed to hold inmates fixed in a grid of numbered rows, unraveled. Curfews and boundaries, enforced under a code of daily terror, collapsed in hours. Compounding the disarray was the range of nationalities among the inmates. Poles, Soviets, French, Jews from Hungary and Germany, resistance fighters from Denmark and Norway, Jehovah's Witnesses, clergy, Roma people. Asterisk, each with internal networks, each with different experiences of camp hierarchy and brutality. Rumors passed quickly that certain capos or assistants had collaborated, that Blockführers were still hiding, that guards had confessed or been identified. By mid-afternoon, at least 2 known instances of prisoner retribution had taken place, killings undocumented by formal U.S. reports but later confirmed in survivor testimonies and post-war statements. One SS man was beaten to death in the laundry block after being pulled from a tunnel. Another was reportedly thrown into a latrine pit behind Block 20 after being identified by French inmates. American MPs arriving by jeep and foot patrol attempted to establish holding points for surrendered personnel, some in wire enclosures hastily set up along the former drill grounds. But the ratio of freed to just-arrived military remained heavily lopsided. Officers instructed that disturbing incidents be logged, survivors interviewed, and prisoner leadership gathered, though in many cases, translations were rough, records scarce, and emotions ungovernable. The quiet of the perimeter masked the storm still working through the camp's core. While jeeps remained idling near the jurhouse, within the gates, generations of buried impulse found release. For many survivors, this was not merely liberation. It was, briefly, reckoning. And in that reckoning, formal justice had not yet arrived. A stamp hits purple ink. A gate opens and closes. The SS now file into wire enclosures under American guard, insignia stripped and belts removed. The same drill grounds where prisoners had been paraded become classification lanes, where interrogators separate Waffen SS from camp staff, trying to map responsibility onto faces and sleeve eagles. The Americans document, photograph, and begin building lists, because trials, not just reports, are already on the horizon. In the background, a Swiss liaison and a U.S. General Staff officer finalize notes on the surrender timeline for the record. The inversion was total. Within 24 hours of Dachau's capture, dozens of former SS guards, disarmed, subdued, and stunned, were marched to wire compounds erected in the artillery training fields adjoining the camp. Barbed wire strung around old parade grounds now held the perpetrators, while the newly liberated, still weak from starvation or disease, passed from barracks to makeshift infirmaries under the protection of American medics. The same camp geography, the perimeter fences, the towers, the razor-straight thoroughfares, remained, but the human order reversed. Handling of captured SS and Wehrmacht personnel at Dachau fell under the authority of units from the U.S. 45th and 42nd Infantry Divisions, reinforced by military police and intelligence teams from 7th Army Headquarters. Under Geneva Convention obligations, recognizable members of enemy forces who had surrendered had to be treated as POWs, even when those men had been guards at what American soldiers now understood to be a death camp. Classification began almost immediately. Interrogators, many of whom were hastily provided with German-speaking junior officers and Jewish refugees serving as language specialists, attempted to divide the captives by role. The key distinction was between Waffen-SS combat troops, some of whom had been housed or trained in the adjacent compound, and camp staff, a term that included clerks, driver messengers, dog handlers, and most crucially, SS Totenkopf personnel. SS identification tags, pay stubs, and uniform elements were collected and sorted. Many SS men had discarded their tunics or insignia before surrender, forcing the Americans to rely on subtle cues. The cut of trousers, hingewear on dagger belts, or tatters of removed patches. The Swiss Red Cross liaison, Victor Mora, who had played a central role in arranging the camp's transfer, continued to advise U.S. and local authorities, pressing that humanitarian protections extend even to surrendering enemy personnel. He was joined during this phase by liaison teams from the U.S. Judge Advocate General's office, already laying the foundation for legal proceedings. Wire enclosures grew daily, with fresh deliveries of captured personnel from towns and villages within a 30-kilometer radius of Dachau. Many of these SS troops had been fleeing or attempting to hide when run down by American patrols or resistance units. The Americans maintained detailed prisoner intake logs that included unit affiliations, last assigned duty stations, and physical descriptions. In several confirmed cases, camp survivors picked out individuals by name and function, leading to immediate separation for further interrogation. Meanwhile, American Signal Corps photographers documented this inversion, capturing rows of silent SS guards lined up behind wire, standing in the same formations they once imposed on others. The images would shortly circulate across Europe and back to Washington, used both in intelligence briefings and emerging war crimes files. The logistical demands of housing, feeding, and securing thousands of enemy prisoners came into tension with the searing moral weight of the location. The U.S. commanders had to manage not only the forward fight toward Munich, which was still active, but the legal handling of individuals now linked directly to atrocities of global scope. Captured materials, including rosters, execution lists, medical experiment logs, and transport orders, flooded into provost offices. Every list, every photograph, every interview became part of a growing case file, not toward battlefield victory, but toward judicial reckoning. In the shadow of the crematorium, custody had changed hands, and with it, so had accountability. A thin carbon copy slides across a desk at Corps headquarters. The subject line reads alleged mistreatment of German guards at Dachau. Statements from GIs, officers, and liberated prisoners, plus terrain sketches of the coal yard and tower, fill the folder. The Inspector General recommends courts-martial for certain soldiers and officers, citing killings of SS personnel after their surrender. The file travels upward even as the 7th Army's broader war crimes mission accelerates. The investigation began less than a month after the liberation of Dachau, prompted by divisional officers who had either witnessed or been informed of the summary executions carried out during the immediate aftermath of the camp's capture. The U.S. Army Inspector General for 7th Army initiated a formal inquiry. The scope began with one narrow question: had American soldiers, acting outside the rules of war, deliberately executed German prisoners of war after they had ceased resistance? U.S. Army regulations and the Geneva Convention of 1929 required that surrendered enemy personnel, regardless of their criminal background, be protected from summary execution. The gravity of what had occurred in the coal yard, where 17 SS men were killed under direct fire from an American-operated machine gun, demanded scrutiny. The weapon's use, captured in photographs showing belt feed lines and casing scatter, was matched to witness testimonies from enlisted men and officers alike. Some accounts described verbal orders to fire. Others testified the act was spontaneous in the wake of the emotional shock from discovering the death train on the siding. The Inspector General's report was methodical. It included hand-drawn terrain diagrams, positioning of troops by squad, cartridge collection points, and interview profiles of all identified participants, both those who fired and those who may have ordered it. The most senior officer implicated was Lieutenant William P. Walsh, with others named as direct participants in the shooting or as having failed to intervene. The report also gathered testimony from American officers who had attempted to stop the violence, including detailed statements describing the actions of Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, who fired a warning shot and placed surviving SS prisoners under guard. That testimony became a dividing line in the file. Those who attempted to restore order were not placed under recommendation for disciplinary action. Those who escalated or failed to act were marked. Despite recommending formal charges and courts-martial, the Inspector General's office did not have the legal authority to prosecute. The file was sent to General George S. Patton, at that time the military governor of Bavaria, and to the commanding officers of the units involved. Their discretion would determine the next step. The file's onward journey was quiet, routed through U.S. Army European Theater headquarters by early summer. By then, the 7th Army's responsibilities had expanded, maintaining security in the American occupation zone, organizing displaced persons, and ramping up for mass-scale war crimes trials targeting high-level Nazi leaders and concentration camp staff. The American military's priorities were shifting rapidly, from battlefield closure to legal reckoning. As for the coal yard killings and satellite executions elsewhere on April 29, the decisions moved above field grade. No courts-martial ever followed. In classified notes, some senior staff privately justified the killings as acts committed in the heat of war, following one of the most horrifying discoveries of the campaign. Still, the file did not vanish. It was archived, copied, cited, and later declassified. It would re-emerge decades later in academic texts and museum exhibits, not as an indictment but as part of a broader reckoning, that even justice, when delivered in wartime, can leave shadows. A stiff-backed folder crosses to U.S. Army Command in Bavaria, another stamp received. Months later, with the occupation in full gear and the legal machine focused on Axis crimes against civilians and POWs, the Dachau killings case is set aside without trial. Senior commanders, including the military governor in the American zone, declined to proceed, and the IG file goes to storage. The war has ended, but the fight over what justice means at Dachau has not. The Inspector General's folder arrived at 3rd Army Headquarters in mid-1945, routed through command channels with clear recommendations that certain personnel from the 45th Infantry Division be prosecuted under Army regulations for violations of the laws of war. The subject was unavoidable. At least 30 German prisoners, nearly all members of the SS, had been executed after surrender, some by gunfire against the coal yard wall, others in scattered corners near guard towers or supply depots within the Dachau complex. The evidence was firm. Testimony from American officers, diagrams, even photographs from Signal Corps teams who entered minutes after the shootings ended. But in the months following Germany's surrender, the terrain of U.S. military justice was shifting. In the American zone of occupation, command responsibility had fractured into layers. Military governors, civil affairs units, legal commissions, intelligence sections, and Judge Advocate General JAG divisions all juggled competing priorities. Reconstruction, denazification, refugee management, early Cold War positioning, and the establishment of war crimes tribunals against high-ranking Nazi officials. The attention of the legal machinery turned sharply away from irregularities committed by GIs and toward those who had orchestrated the Holocaust, the euthanasia program, and the plunder of Europe. By autumn 1945, General George S. Patton, serving as military governor of Bavaria, declined to authorize further action on the coal yard killings. Patton had previously expressed, in both command notes and private correspondence, skepticism toward prosecuting American soldiers for incidents committed in the wake of liberating such camps. His stance was echoed by other senior officers, many of whom believed that the emotional toll on frontline troops made such incidents understandable, if not excusable. Based on that rationale, the case was quietly dropped without formal notification to all involved. The effect was not one of closure, but suspension. The case was neither absolved nor aired. Instead, the file, labeled Dachau alleged mistreatment of prisoners, was archived by the Army, first in the European Theater Record Group, and later transferred to the U.S. National Archives. For decades, it remained buried in low-level correspondence logs and summary reports, referenced only indirectly in Army legal reviews. The decision not to prosecute set an implicit precedent that military justice in the post-war period would draw a sharp distinction between crimes committed by occupying American forces and atrocities committed by Axis regimes. This contrast would shape how the legal and moral history of Dachau was written in the immediate years after the war. The U.S. Army's public focus remained outward, toward the Dachau trials of camp staff, the Mauthausen prosecutions, and the Nuremberg Tribunal. Yet even within the legal offices of the U.S. occupation, staff officers debated the consequence of inaction. In JAG meeting minutes from late 1946, concern was raised that the failure to address the killings, however emotionally charged the context, might weaken the legitimacy of Allied courts adjudicating war crimes committed by Germans. The concern was noted and shelved. The war had concluded. Legal frameworks were hardening. But at Dachau, the lines between justice, vengeance, and pragmatic authority had blurred, just long enough to alter the course of accountability. The inspector's report would not vanish, but neither would it be heard aloud. It would sit, filed and unacted upon, beneath a stamp whose ink had long gone dry. You step into a room with rough wooden benches, a U.S. flag on the wall, a stenographer's table, and translation headsets coiled on chairs. Outside, the roll call square sits quiet. The U.S. Army converts a former SS administrative block into a courtroom for military commissions trying war crimes under occupation authority. Evidence flows in. Camp rosters, morgue logs, identity tags, photographs, film reels shot by Signal Corps teams. Where commands once moved down the hierarchy, charges now move up to a panel in olive drab. The decision to situate military tribunals on the grounds of the former concentration camp itself was deliberate. In July 1945, as the U.S. began piecing together its war crimes program in occupied Germany, Dachau was selected as the venue for the first and most immediate trials. The former SS administrative offices, intact and well-built, provided secure rooms with enough space to house legal teams, translators, witnesses under guard, and documentation storage. The proximity to the crime scenes, crematorium, roll call square, execution yard, gave prosecutors a visual and moral advantage in presenting their cases. The courtroom was institutional but utilitarian. Desks were built from surplus lumber. The U.S. flag was hung near the judge's bench, which was manned by a rotating panel of U.S. Army officers, usually 3 to 5 in number. The proceedings were governed by Army Regulation 10-10, which authorized military commissions under occupation law. Unlike in Nuremberg, where the International Military Tribunal handled only top-tier state actors, the Dachau courtroom focused on mid- and lower-level war crimes defendants, particularly SS guards and officials captured on site. The American legal teams gathered their evidence quickly and thoroughly. U.S. Signal Corps footage of the liberation, which captured the railcar corpses, the disheveled survivors, and the camp's infrastructure, was edited into reels and displayed during sessions. Translation was constant. German, English, Polish, French, Russian, and Czech passed through interpreters' headsets. Affidavits from survivors were paired with physical exhibits, bone saws, payroll rosters, execution logs, all recovered from offices abandoned by fleeing SS personnel. Many of the defendants came into court from holding cells just meters away, wearing plain-issued tunics and identified by number. Their previous rank and function, Blockführer, medical assistant, roll call overseer, were read before opening arguments. Some faced individual charges. Most were tried as part of group indictments, accused of participating in a criminal system where personal action wasn't always required, only presence and continued service. Spectators were few, mostly fellow officers, select journalists, and security personnel. Yet transcripts were sent to higher headquarters in Frankfurt and Washington, contributing to future legal instruction and diplomatic briefings. These were not show trials. They were, in the eyes of the Army, precedents, swift, evidentiary-based, compliant with both military code and evolving international law. The symbolism of location hung over every moment. Outside the courtroom, the Appellplatz, once a theater of punishment and control for prisoners, now lay silent, occasionally crossed by interpreters or messengers. It formed the psychological backdrop for witnesses recounting beatings, dehydration, exposure drills, and selections for death, all conducted within sight of the very building now retrofitted for judgment. For many of those serving in legal staff roles, some of them Jewish refugees in U.S. uniform, others veterans of combat in the Rhineland and Alsace, the choice to use Dachau as both a site of liberation and prosecution was not just practical, it was judicial choreography. To put SS personnel on trial in the same rooms where orders had once been typed and signed restored, in real time, the broken line between power and accountability. And in doing so, the courtroom at Dachau set a permanent tone, one echoed across other proceedings to follow. Justice, here, stood on the grounds it meant to condemn. A clerk reads 40 names. A thick registry book lies open to pages marked Dachau. The first Dachau trial in late 1945 centers on the camp's leadership and staff, alleging a common design to abuse, starve, and murder. Survivors testify to roll calls, beatings, transport selections, and medical experiments. Prosecutors walk the panel through the crematorium and the unfinished gas chamber as physical exhibits. The court accepts that membership in the apparatus itself binds responsibility, and verdicts stack quickly. The trial of United States versus Martin Gottfried Weiss et al. Opened on 15 November 1945, inside the former SS compound converted into a courtroom by the U.S. Army. Weiss had served as the commandant at Dachau from 1942 to 1943, returning briefly in 1945 as the administration collapsed. He sat now with 39 co-defendants, including medical officers, Blockführers, administrative clerks, and senior SS functionaries, each tied through rank, duty, or physical presence to the operation of a camp where over 30,000 prisoners died. The legal theory presented by the prosecution relied on common design, a doctrine asserting that the defendants need not have personally killed to be guilty. By willingly participating in the operation of the camp, and by occupying positions that sustained its violent systems, each shared culpability in crimes against humanity. This approach, later replicated at other camps, allowed prosecutors to dismantle the notion that only those who swung a baton or pulled a trigger bore responsibility. The evidence presented was comprehensive. Survivor testimony detailed forced labor rotations, Appellplatz roll calls lasting 12 to 18 hours, withholding of food and medicine, and routine executions for infractions as minor as speaking without permission. Medical experiments surfaced through hospital records and recovered files, including trials of phosgene gas exposure, high-altitude simulations, and deliberately induced infections. The Signal Corps liberation films gave the court a moving record. Exhibits included death charts, crematorium operation logs, and dissection notes signed by SS physicians. Some defendants attempted to challenge jurisdiction, while others claimed ignorance, or that they were only following orders. A few, including medical staff, acknowledged involvement but insisted they acted under coercion. The panel, composed of U.S. Army officers with legal training, deliberated on these defenses in closed session. On 13 December 1945, the verdicts were announced. 36 guilty, 28 sentenced to death by hanging, the rest to long prison terms. Weiss and his deputy, Dr. Klaus Karl Schilling, were both condemned. The sentences underscored the legal clarity that had emerged. Service inside an exterminatory system was no longer neutral. It was the first major U.S.-led war crimes case involving a concentration camp. It would not be the last. A folded black cap and a length of new hemp sit on a table at War Criminals Prison No. 1, Landsberg am Lech. In late May 1946, the U.S. Army carries out multiple executions from the Dachau case list, the hangings scheduled by the hour and certified by officers with stopwatches and forms. Other sentences assign long terms of hard labor. The place of punishment is not Dachau, but its docket fills the gallows. Located about 60 kilometers west of Munich, the fortified prison at Landsberg am Lech had a pre-war history with political resonance. It was here that Adolf Hitler served part of his sentence following the failed Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. After the Allied victory in Europe, the U.S. 7th Army commandeered the facility and rebranded it War Criminals Prison No. 1, repurposing its thick walls and enclosed yards into a place of containment and execution for Axis perpetrators. By May 1946, the prison held dozens of Nazi war criminals sentenced by U.S. military commissions, in particular, those convicted at Dachau during trials related to the concentration camp system. The American execution detail, composed of a small unit trained in procedural methods, adhered to military protocol with rigid formality. Each execution followed a timeline: prisoner transfer, identity confirmation, final inspection by a physician, recitation of sentence, and the drop, timed and logged. The gallows platform at Landsberg was constructed for efficiency. On 28 and 29 May 1946, in 2 days, 28 condemned men from the Dachau main trial were hanged, including former Commandant Martin Gottfried Weiss and senior SS functionaries. Witnesses included senior U.S. military officers, chaplains, and medical personnel. Each execution was witnessed and recorded with meticulous detail: length of drop, time to death, and confirmation of cessation of heartbeat, a bureaucratic end to crimes that defied accounting. The use of the gallows stood in contrast to Dachau itself, where sentencing had occurred. American legal planners had deliberately chosen to separate trial from execution, placing a physical and conceptual buffer between judgment and punishment. Landsberg became the endpoint of a logistical pipeline that began in survivor testimony, passed through courtroom deliberation, and ended in the noose. The death certificates, typed and filed, listed judicial execution per order of the United States Army. Beyond the executions, Landsberg also enforced the longer-term sentences. Convicted guards, doctors, and administrators assigned to hard labor were interned for years within the same walls, in cells once occupied by political revolutionaries. Not all would serve their full terms, but in early 1946, the scale of punishment was still heavy, and the U.S. Army's justice system moved with finality. A photo of the granite quarry and its 186 steps is propped beside the bench. The name Mauthausen runs across a charged sheet. In spring 1946, the U.S. brings the Mauthausen case to the Dachau courtroom, indicting 61 men for a system of annihilation by labor. Survivors detail quarry marches, beating routines, and starvation rations. The prosecution ties guard companies to deaths by policy and practice. The panel issues death sentences across the board, with executions later carried out at Landsberg. The Mauthausen trial, formally titled United States v. Hans Altfeldisch et al., began on 29 March 1946 within the same converted SS block at Dachau, where the earlier cases had been heard. The scale was larger. The charge sheets listed 61 defendants, all SS staff or affiliated personnel from Mauthausen and its network of subcamps in Austria, one of the most brutal nodes in the Nazi concentration camp system. Here, murder was not incidental to policy. It was the policy. The camp's granite quarry, known as the Wiener Graben, was both an industrial site and a death sentence. The prosecution relied on a mixture of survivor testimonies, captured documentation, and forensic photographs taken by the U.S. military after the camp's liberation by American forces in May 1945. Prisoners described being worked to death, literally marched up and down 186 stone steps multiple times a day while carrying heavy loads. The steps became known to survivors as the stairs of death. Camp guards often pushed exhausted men from the heights of the quarry cliffs. Others were shot or left untreated for wounds and hypothermia. These were not isolated incidents but routine practices, integrated into camp discipline and labor quotas. Command responsibility was not difficult to establish. The camp operated with explicit directives to exterminate through labor, targeting Jews, Soviet POWs, Spanish Republicans, and political dissidents. Although some defendants argued that their roles were clerical or logistical, evidence showed that guards and support staff, whether deployed in the quarry, the infirmary, or the food distribution system, participated in a camp machinery designed to kill slowly and under the guise of work. As with earlier trials, the doctrine of common design anchored the legal reasoning. Participation in the functioning of Mauthausen constituted complicity in mass murder. Defendants were identified by survivors, many pointed out in the courtroom itself, and each case was threaded back through camp rosters, eyewitness reports, and internal SS records captured during the Wehrmacht collapse. The verdicts delivered on 13 May 1946 were unambiguous. All 61 defendants were found guilty. 58 were sentenced to death by hanging, while the remaining 3 received life imprisonment. Executions were carried out over the summer and autumn at Landsberg prison, under the same U.S. oversight that handled the Dachau sentences. The sweeping judgments marked the trial as one of the most decisive in the post-war American system. If Dachau exemplified control through terror, Mauthausen epitomized extermination through labor. And in the courthouse where perpetrators once marched prisoners past the Appellplatz, a new reckoning took place, not by shovel or rifle, but by sentence and cord. A campaign map of the Ardennes is unrolled on an easel. A winter photograph shows a road near Bognes littered with American dead. In mid-1946, the court in Dachau hears the Malmedy massacre case, not a camp crime but a battlefield atrocity against U.S. POWs, trying 73 SS men. The panel convicts, many received death sentences. Allegations about coercive pretrial interrogations later trigger congressional scrutiny and army reviews, pulling Dachau's legal work into a political storm. The Malmedy massacre case, officially United States versus Valentin Bersin et al., opened at Dachau on 16 May 1946, just days after verdicts were handed down in the Mauthausen trial. Unlike the prison and camp cases that defined other proceedings in the same courtroom, this indictment centered on actions during combat, specifically the mass execution of American prisoners of war near Bognes, Belgium, in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. The atrocity had become infamous almost immediately after its discovery. On 17 December 1944, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, under the tactical command of Joachim Paper, intercepted a U.S. convoy from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. After a brief firefight, around 120 surrendering GIs were herded into a field, then machine-gunned at close range. By the time reconnaissance patrols returned to the site, survivors were crawling through snow and dozens of corpses lay frozen in place. The Dachau trial named 73 defendants, from junior enlisted men up through senior officers, including Paper himself, accusing them of conspiracy to murder unarmed prisoners and of carrying out orders in violation of the Hague and Geneva Conventions. Prosecutors introduced combat maps, aerial reconnaissance photos, affidavits from survivors, and German truck drivers forced to observe or participate in mop-up shootings. Several were also linked to other executions carried out by Paper's Kampfgruppe during its push through Stavelot, Hansfeld, and Trois Ponts. Verdicts were delivered on 16 July 1946. The panel convicted all 73 men. Of those, 43 received death sentences, and the rest were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. But the case would not end there. Allegations emerged in the months afterward that U.S. interrogators had used coercive methods on several defendants during pretrial investigations. Some claimed they had been beaten, deprived of food, or threatened with extradition to other countries under harsher jurisdictions. These accusations triggered a full review by Army Legal Section personnel and eventually reached the floor of the U.S. Senate, where critics warned that the Malmedy verdicts risked undercutting American claims to moral authority in post-war justice. By early 1949, under pressure from Congress and international observers, the U.S. military commuted many of the sentences, including multiple death penalties. Some of the convictions remained, but the political fallout cast a shadow over all subsequent Dachau-based trials, forcing a rebalancing between speed, retribution, and legal process. The Malmedy case, tried on the ground where administrative orders for Dachau's own atrocities had once been processed, blurred the lines between vengeance and law not through mob justice, but through interrogation rooms and diplomatic calculus. Dachau's courtroom had judged crimes from the battlefield just as it had judged crimes from the camp, and in doing so, it invited the world to inspect its methods as closely as its verdicts. Headsets crackle as German, Polish, Czech, French, and English pass through interpreters from the War Crimes Group. A whiteboard lists case numbers and dates. The Dachau commissions operate under U.S. military law adapted for war crimes, with rules of evidence, affidavits, and limited discovery compared to civilian courts. The doctrine of common design becomes a backbone, binding staff work to murder without requiring proof of each act. Defense counsel protests scope and process. The court maintains that the camp system is itself the crime. Inside the courtroom at Dachau, the rhythm of trials was measured in languages and logistics. Each day began with a roll of case files, interpreters assigned, and defendants seated in order. The War Crimes Group, 7th U.S. Army, constructed a procedural infrastructure under occupation law, governed by military commissions, distinct from civilian courts in both form and constraint. Civilian due process rights, including extended pretrial discovery and standard rules of admissibility, did not fully apply. What governed instead was military necessity, streamlined protocol, and clarity of record. The language barrier remained constant. Witnesses and defendants often spoke no common tongue. Headsets transmitted real-time translations to each participant, facilitated by interpreters drawn from a diverse pool. Jewish refugees in U.S. uniform, displaced persons with legal training, and allied personnel fluent in multiple Central European languages. Every misheard phrase, every mistranslated order, had the potential to shift the weight of a sentence. The court's central legal tool, the doctrine of common design, allowed prosecution not only of individuals who directly committed atrocities, but of those who participated knowingly in the operation of a criminal system. Under this doctrine, the camp itself was the evidence. Guarding a fence, filing medical logs, organizing labor rosters, all were acts that enabled mass murder. Specific violent incidents were still investigated, but guilt did not hinge solely on them. If the defendant belonged to the machinery, they shared in what it did. This concept clashed fiercely with defense arguments. Counsel often claimed that the staff roles were administrative, or that lower-ranking guards had no choice but to follow orders in a totalitarian regime. They pointed to the lack of smoking guns in individual cases, no eyewitnesses, no direct acts of murder. But the court, guided by precedents and directives from Army legal advisors, held its line. Dachau functioned to dehumanize, exploit, and destroy. Those who made it function owned its outcomes. Key cases tested this boundary. Medical personnel, for instance, were often sentenced not for conducting experiments themselves, but for assisting in their documentation or patient selection. Transport clerks were convicted for managing deportation train records whose destinations were known to be deadly. Across multiple trials, the Commission's stance remained consistent. System participation equals system guilt. In the records, verdict sheets bear clipped notations, guilty under common design doctrine. They reflect a shift in legal thinking, a move from individual misdeeds to systemic complicity. For the Americans at Dachau, assembling this case, law meant building a foundation for how future generations might try to understand, not just who gave the orders, but who kept the machine running. A memo stamped War Crimes Review Board lands in a tray at the Office of Military Government. Another bears the signature of the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy. Between 1948 and 1951, panels reweigh sentences from Dachau cases, considering mitigation, age, rank, and the contested pretrial methods in some files. Dozens of death sentences are commuted. Prison terms are reduced. The pendulum of post-war justice, initially hard and swift, moves toward clemency as the Cold War reshapes priorities. By 1948, the tone in occupied Germany had changed. The American approach to justice, once defined by urgency and moral clarity, now faced an altered political landscape. The focus was no longer only on Nazi crimes, but increasingly on managing the stability of West Germany as Cold War fault lines hardened across Europe. Amid demands for reconciliation and the need to bolster a democratic ally on Soviet borders, the very courtroom sentences that had once embodied reckoning came under renewed review. The War Crimes Review Board, a body established under U.S. military and civilian occupation authorities, was tasked with reconsidering hundreds of cases tried under the Dachau commissions. The reviews did not erase the findings of guilt. Instead, they applied a set of criteria that balanced legal judgment with evolving policy. Extenuating circumstances, degree of personal responsibility, youth at the time of the crime, and the presence or absence of direct violence. A key player in this shift was John J. McCloy, appointed in 1949 as the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany. A former Assistant Secretary of War, McCloy became the final authority on clemency recommendations. Under his leadership in 1950 and 1951, numerous sentences, including many from the Malmedy and Mauthausen trials, were commuted from death to life, or from life to fixed prison terms. His actions courted praise from West German leaders and criticism from Holocaust survivors and witnesses who had testified just a few years earlier. The decisions were often based on classified summaries prepared by legal advisors, which included reviews of interrogation techniques. In the Malmedy case particularly, allegations of coercive pretrial methods prompted sentence mitigation across the board. Meanwhile, former SS guards and administrators from Dachau and its satellite camps, whose roles had been tied to systemic abuse more than direct killing, were prioritized for clemency. Inside Landsberg prison, where the sentences were being served, Dozens of executions had already been carried out, but for those who remained, conditions shifted from permanent condemnation to eventual release. By 1954, nearly all those imprisoned at Landsberg under the Dachau trials had been released under a combination of clemency, parole, or sentence expiration. In the annals of justice, the first phase of retribution had given way to the calculus of geopolitics. Judicial clarity had become politically pliable. A ration card receives a violet stamp at the gate. The roll call square fills not with prisoners but with displaced families queuing for housing and food. From 1945 into 1948, Dachau functions as a DP camp and as a training site for the new Bavarian police under U.S. supervision. Barracks are repaired and refitted. Fences remain. The same geometry now backs humanitarian logistics and internal security rather than terror. After the cessation of combat in Europe in May 1945, the question of what to do with former concentration camp sites became both practical and symbolic. Dachau, having been partially intact and already appropriated by the U.S. military for war crimes legal proceedings, was quickly reconfigured to serve multiple, and at times conflicting, purposes. Between mid-1945 and late 1948, the camp housed two overlapping institutions: a displaced persons DP center and a post-war police training academy. The DP population came first, made up of liberated prisoners with no viable place to return. Many were stateless Jews, others were Roma, political refugees, or forced laborers who feared persecution in Soviet-occupied zones. U.S. Army and UNRRA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, officials jointly administered the complex, establishing food distribution stations, registration desks, temporary classrooms, and health clinics in the old barrack huts. Each family or group received documentation, ration cards stamped with Allied and UN seals, housing assignments by block, and guidance about potential relocation to the U.S., Britain, France, or Palestine. Despite the humanitarian shift in function, the architecture did not change. The watchtowers still stood. The fence lines remained electrified through 1946 until their power circuits were cut. Pathways still formalized movement. Camp survivors now walked the same gravel between Appellplatz and Block 18, but now as residents, teachers, shoemakers, barbers. The spatial memory of violence lingered beneath daily survival. Meanwhile, a second operation took shape under American oversight: the retraining of Bavarian police. In an attempt to re-establish civil order and displace Soviet influence, the U.S. Office of Military Government approved the use of Dachau's former SS training grounds to prepare recruits for duty in the new West German Republic. In 1946, classes began for the first cohorts, drawn from vetted civilians. Instructors included both American MPs and German officers cleared of SS affiliation. This coexistence led to paradox. Holocaust survivors lived within sight of Germans in uniform, again marching for inspection, but now under American flags. The physical layout, designed for control, now hosted rehabilitation and enforcement. Yet the moral tension remained unresolved. Dachau, before it became a memorial, became a mirror, showing what Europe remained capable of building atop the footprints of its worst crimes. A bronze plaque is drilled into concrete on the Appellplatz. Survivors' committees and the Bavarian state open the Dachau memorial site. Exhibition panels mount camp photographs and trial summaries. The courtroom period enters the narrative as part of the reckoning conducted on the grounds. The crematorium area becomes a focal point for mourning and instruction. The site formalizes memory where procedure once triumphed and failed in turn. By May 1965, exactly 20 years after liberation, Dachau had passed through multiple identities: SS Training Center, Concentration Camp, War Crimes Tribunal, Displaced Persons Hub, and Police Academy. Each layer had left physical residues, painted signs, rebuilt doors, military fencing, and emotional contradiction. But in 1965, the site took on a new, deliberate form. As surviving prisoners aged into the role of teachers and witnesses, they demanded more than silence. From their efforts, supported cautiously by the Bavarian government, emerged the Dachau concentration camp memorial site. The driving force behind the memorial was the Comité International de Dachau, a survivor committee composed of political prisoners, resistance fighters, clergy, and camp veterans across Europe. They insisted that memory should not just be preserved through statues or plaques, but through education. Their proposal was audacious. Return Dachau to a state where its atrocities could be studied, contextualized, and never abstracted. The Bavarian state agreed, forming a partnership with the survivors and the Institute for Contemporary History, Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich, to reconstruct part of the original site. 2 barracks were rebuilt according to plans recovered from SS archives, this time filled not with beds or straw mattresses, but with exhibitions, the administrative logic of brutality rendered in maps, rosters, roll call sheets, and survivor portraits. Other areas were left stark. The Appellplatz, where epaulets once cracked skulls, and the crematorium, left as it stood in April 1945, ovens cold and untouched, doors open. And for the first time, the war crimes trials held after liberation were given space in the permanent exhibition. Courtroom sketches, docket records, and sentencing memoranda were placed under glass, linking the system of atrocity with its judicial reckoning. Panels explained how the Americans had used parts of the SS complex for trial proceedings, turning former command rooms into sites of legal judgment, temporary, imperfect, but recorded. The memorial site pressed no slogans onto its visitors. Instead, it let structure, silence, and documentation speak. Where once orders had echoed, now there were school groups and guided tour. And beneath the plaque on the Appellplatz, memory fixed itself not in absolution, but in permanence. A small footnote on a museum label cites the Inspector General report. A visitor leans in to read. For decades, numbers and stories about the April 29 killings swung widely, until archival files and historians' work narrowed the estimates, identifying multiple shooting locations and distinguishing prisoner reprisals from GI actions. Some details remain unknown, including exact counts and individual shooters in specific corners of the SS complex. The record rejects inflated myths and refuses to erase the rage of the day. The killings that followed Dachau's liberation on 29 April 1945 have long occupied a volatile space in public memory. For years, competing accounts, some based on eyewitness testimony, others on hearsay, and some heavily politicized, produced diverging figures and conflicting implications. In the post-war environment, American commanders, journalists, and even some former prisoners downplayed the scope or intensity of the reprisals. Others amplified them. Only with the release of U.S. Army Inspector General records in the 1970s did a clearer picture begin to take shape. The investigation, classified at the time, had documented at least 4 major shooting incidents involving surrendered German personnel. The prominent coal yard execution, shootings near Tower B, and separate cases within the adjacent SS barracks and infirmary areas. The report estimated between 30 and 50 deaths, with partial identifications in some cases, but stressed that for several locations, no firm accounting could be made. Historians such as Charles W. Sidner and Eugen Zarusky later revisited early exaggerations. Rumors of hundreds gunned down, fueled in part by inflammatory post-war writing and Cold War-era narratives, proved unsupported by documentation. By the 1990s, a scholarly consensus had emerged. The number of German personnel executed without trial at Dachau between April 29 and April 30 was approximately 35 to 50, depending on which events are strictly included, and whether prisoner-led reprisals are counted alongside GI-involved incidents. Still, ambiguities remain. In sworn affidavits, American soldiers offered conflicting identifications of who gave the orders, and some claimed memory loss or emotional trauma. Former SS guards captured in civilian clothing were often killed without knowing which unit seized them. No complete list of names exists, and the distinction between spontaneous revenge and systematic retribution is blurred in the chaos of the moment. Rather than dissolve the history into moral binaries, the record now reflects its complexity. Yes, war crimes occurred at the liberation of Dachau, but they occurred in a space freshly saturated with the evidence of genocide. The ethical tension does not cancel the victory of liberation, but neither does it absolve the violence that followed it. The museum display, small, measured, footnoted, offers no slogan, just a question. How should a liberated world behave in the ruins of evil? A school group steps into a reconstructed courtroom space. The guide points to a photograph of a U.S. major reading verdicts in the former SS block. The Dachau Commission set a precedent, holding trials inside the machinery of the crime, linking evidence to place with unblinking force. Policymakers later debated methods and outcomes, but the choice of venue left a mark. Who signs the pass that lets a chaplain through this door is a small act. The larger act was to make law stand where law had been broken. The decision to conduct war crimes trials within Dachau itself was more than jurisdictional. It was symbolic and tactical. The physical location of a courtroom just meters from where deportation lists had been signed, from where death orders had been typed, and from where victims had perished, generated a form of courtroom gravity rarely replicated. The very walls of the trial chamber had once housed the bureaucracy of extermination. Now they witnessed the affirmation of law. For the Allies, and especially for the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, this choice anchored justice in place, tying accountability to geography as well as act. It was not merely expedient. As hundreds of thousands of documents poured in, from liberated camp files, survivor lists, and SS personnel records, the proximity allowed trial teams to trace questions back to original locations. A defendant's desk could be confirmed by walking 40 meters from the courtroom. A survivor pointing to a beating block didn't need a translator's description, just a window. The trials at Dachau processed over 1,600 defendants between 1945 and 1948, from major cases like Dachau, Mauthausen, and Flossenburg, to subcamp personnel tried in batches. The courtroom thus became not only a venue of judgment, but part of the evidence itself. Jurors, U.S. officers trained in military code, entered and exited through a gate once operated by perpetrators, passed watchtowers still bearing bullet scars, and heard testimony from survivors who hadn't left the ground since liberation. This unprecedented courtroom proximity had a psychological as well as legal effect. It bridged the gap between atrocity and abstraction. Policy makers later weighed concerns about the swift process of the Dachau commissions, their reliance on affidavits, and the pressures on both prosecution and defense in a post-war setting. Critics argued that this form of justice, conducted under military authority rather than international accord, might compromise fairness, but few challenged the raw clarity of the site itself. To try perpetrators in a courtroom built from the framework of their own command center carried a logic that transcended jurisprudence. It was justice in direct reply, law reclaiming the place where law had been annihilated. Today, when visitors enter the memorial and stand inside the restored courtroom, once a realm of SS orders, then of American military law, they walk inside a dual archive, of horror and of its accounting. And though few trials are held in such direct proximity again, the Dachau courtroom endures as argument and example, that justice is not only an outcome, but also a location.